So we're continuing with the laws of cooking on Shabbat. The primary thing that we talked about yesterday was that it is forbidden to cook on Shabbat, and that it is independent of the rule of lighting a fire, even though to a certain degree, cooking, in its general sense, involves using a fire, but they're two separate things. You're not allowed to light a fire or extinguish a fire, but you're also not allowed to cook, even if that was a pre-existing fire or something like that. And we had started talking about yesterday returning items to the flame, meaning something that was cooked before Shabbat and put in the refrigerator, and now it's being reheated. And when we left off yesterday was, what if it's something that's a solid that becomes a liquid if you cook it, right? What if it's a solid that becomes a liquid if you cook it? So we're going to read a couple things, and then we'll get to what that answer ends up being. So he says, when we allow, remember, we're allowing to cook something to reheat something that was a solid or mostly solid. So that means certainly, like, if you have some maza, right? So if you have some maza, you could put the maza on the hot plate or the blech on Shabbat morning. Why? Because the maza has been cooked already. It was fried before Shabbat and or baked, or however they made it. And now you're just reheating it, and the maza is all solid. How do I know it's all solid? Because you could pick it up with your fingers. It's solid, right? So the maza is no problem to put on the blech. Right, and I'd put the same thing with bread, right, and solid, and the same thing with noodles and calzones. Even though the noodles and calzones, maybe it has some cheese in it and some oil and liquids around it, but by and large, it's a solid, and so on, right? So he says that but if it's a liquid, you're not allowed, right? And we said yesterday, right, like a hamid or a soup or something of that nature, you're not allowed to heat up. So I'm not allowed to heat water up, right? Oh, that's obvious, because water almost, whatever. But even let's say I, made a coffee before Shabbat, right? And now I want to reheat the coffee. I cannot do that, right? I can't take my iced coffee and make it hot coffee on Shabbat because it's a liquid. Now, he says,
how does the shul have coffee in the morning on the Shabbat?
Right, so it's a great question. We're gonna get to it, but basically, it has to have been in some way set up from before Shabbat. We're gonna get to the shul's coffee, which I anticipated, but we're gonna get there. So he says like this. He says what we were talking about before, right, which is to warm cold food that was cooked completely from Erev Shabbat. He says it's true even if the meat has some fat on it, right? And you may know, right, if you have meat that has fat or something on it, the fat is congealed, and now when I heat it, that maybe it's going to melt a little bit. He says that's okay. It's not a problem for Sephardim. Ashkenazim wouldn't allow that, but Ashkenazim, again, are much more strict, as we said, in general on this area. He says, however, let's say you have an item that was placed in the freezer, right? Like let's say bread, right? The bread was in the freezer, and now you want to take it out of the freezer and put it on the hot plate, put it on the blech to thaw out and to maybe even be warm when you're eating it during lunch or something like that. He says the bread will often have kind of like ice or frost on it. He says, and you should, as best you can, brush that off because that's not part of the bread really. And by heating that up, you're melting ice, warming water, and you can't do that. So so on some of these things, you have to be a little bit careful about how you do it. And basically, the defining characteristic is going to be, is that item part of the food or not? In other words, if you're talking about a mechshi and there's some liquids that are in it that just are part of the mechshi, that's fine, right? But if it's not part of it and you could remove it, then you should do your best to do so. Okay. Any questions on anything that we've done so far? Because now I'm going to move into the next category, which is making tea and coffee on Shabbat. Yeah, great. Okay, tea and coffee is.
Wait, Rabbi, I just want to clarify from yesterday. You said the blech is fine, the hot plate is fine, and then with was it the oven that you could remove the knobs, or only
So
on
we're
the
going to
stove?
get to an oven. An oven has some other aspects to it. For now, let's stick with the stove and an open fire. The oven has another problem, which has to do with opening it and sealing it and so on. So I'm going to say let's leave the oven out of it for now. For now, let's leave the oven out of it. We're really talking more the hot plate. The oven. The challenge with the oven is sealing it creates a different problem that we prefer we not do. So that's why if we're going to talk about reheating food on Shabbat, it should generally be not in an oven. It should be on a stove top that's open, but an open stove top, but that the flame is covered by some piece of metal or through some kind of electric hot plate that is different, so you don't adjust the dials, or they have also like warming drawers or carts and things like that are also things that are potentially usable. But an oven is a little bit more challenging. But give me a little bit. Okay, so it says like this: Davar shene'efeh o shenitzleh mutar levashelo b'Shabbat b'mashkeh. He says, if something was cooked already, there's no problem to take it and put it into hot water on Shabbat, right? So what would be an example of this? Like, let's say I have a soup, right? And now the soup is very hot, right? Maybe even boiling or close, it was boiling at some point. And now I took it off the oven, right? And now I want to take a piece of bread and throw it in there, or croutons or noodles or something like that. Can I put that in the soup, right? And the answer is yes, I can. If the item was already baked before, right? If it was already baked before, like a piece of bread or a crouton or a piece of kak, I could put it in the hot water because it was cooked from beforehand. So that's not a problem.
But Rabbi, you said you couldn't heat up liquid. You're saying it's because you heated it up before Shabbat.
It was heated from before.
So you're not talking about Saturday.
Somehow it was, maybe in a tiger pot, and some other way. It was heated from before. You can't heat the water, but you have like soup. Soup on Friday night is a classic example, right? I have soup very often on Friday night. So now the soup comes to the table. The soup is no problem because it was cooked from before Shabbat. And we took it off the fire. Now it's not on the fire anymore. Now it's in my bowl right in front of me. It's very hot, right? It's hot enough to cook something, right? If the item was cooked already, right? If it was cooked already, it was a solid, right? Like bread or croutons or a kak or something like that. You can put that in the hot soup, right? And this is going to come into play for understanding tea. It says, "V'chen mutar la'arot mayim rotchim memecham ha'omed al ha'esh letoch kos sheyesh bo kafeh." מפני שהקפה כלוי מערב שבת, ואין בישול אחר כליה, והמחמיר לתת קפה לתוך הכוס רק לאחר שיראו בו המים חמים, כדי שיהיה כלי שני, תבוא עליו ברכה. He says, so, if you have coffee, he says, and you're even allowed to pour onto it. He says, so if I have coffee, he says, and the coffee was cooked from before Shabbat, right? Meaning the coffee grounds, or however the coffee item that you use, which is a solid, right? The coffee, I'm not talking about the liquid coffee. I'm talking about like the powder, and if that coffee is cooked from beforehand, which many of the powders are, it says if the powder is cooked from beforehand, you could even pour onto the powder and effectively make the coffee. So that, some people asked me, how could you make certain coffee? If coffee is cooked from beforehand, so it would be allowed to do that. He says there is another thing you might want to do, which is to pour the water into the cup first, and then put the coffee into the cup. And the reason being is that if you, within cooking, there's different levels of the power of an item that cooks something. And the different levels are was the item was the container which is holding the hot water, was it the container that was on the fire or not? Right? If the container was the container that was on the fire, that's called kli rishon. If it was the container that was not on the fire, that's called kli sheni. So for example, right, if I have a kettle, right, and I take that kettle and I put water, fill it with water, and I put it on the flame, and now the water gets really hot. That kettle is called kli rishon because the kettle itself is very, very hot because it was heated on the flame and it maintains some heat. Even if I take it off the flame, it's still going to be really hot. So the kettle, the pot, the tiger pot, which warms the water or keeps it warm, all of those are kli rishon. What's a kli sheni? The mug, right? The mug gets the water from the kettle or the tiger pot or the pot or whatever it may be, but the mug itself doesn't have any heat of its own because it wasn't heated. It only might, if it's hot, it's only hot because of the water that's inside of it, but it itself doesn't provide any heat, and therefore it's going to have a much lower, if non-existent, cooking power. So therefore, in the halacha, we make a big difference between kli rishon and kli sheni. So I want to make sure everyone got that before I go forward, because that's a key thing that we're going to talk about as we go forward, right? Is the difference between kli rishon, which means the first pot, right, which means it was on the fire, and kli sheni, which doesn't have any heating capacity of its own because it was never on the fire. Everyone understand the difference between the two? Give me nods, because I need to know everyone gets that, because that's going to be something that's going to come up as we go forward. Good. Okay.
Rabbi, just one quick question. I get the kli rishon, kli sheni.
Mm-hmm.
Are you allowed to heat your coffee cup?
So then it would become a kli rishon, and then it would be a problem, right?
Okay.
Meaning if the cup, the thing that makes the criteria that tells you, is this a kli rishon or kli sheni, is do the walls of the utensil itself, do they add heat to that which is inside it or not?
Okay.
If they do, it's a kli rishon. Right, so I know there are some like, electric coffee cups or something like that. Right. Or if you had a metal coffee cup, you could theoretically put it on the fire and it could do the trick also. So you have to know whether or not the pot is kli rishon or kli sheni. That makes a big difference.
If it's just heated by if like I put hot water in my cup first, then pour it out, and then I put my coffee in. Is that considered? But that's still temperature's probably less than what the temperature of the coffee would be.
It's not really based on the temperature. It's based on whether or not the utensil, the pot, the cup, whatever we're talking about, was heated on the flame or not. If it was, then it's kli rishon. Then it has the, right. So we're about to get to
go ahead.
How we do this. Says it says if you have instant coffee, right? It says instant coffee is cooked already, right? So what they call Nescafe in Israel, which means I don't know if they got it from Nestle because but Nes means miracle, right? It's miracle coffee, right? So basically, if you have instant coffee, what is instant coffee, right? Basically, they took the coffee. They made it already. Then they dry it out and they turn it into a powder. So all you need to do is add water. Right? It says and obviously hot water. Right. So he says if you have that, he says no problem. You could make that on Shabbat because it was already cooked from beforehand. And once it's cooked, it's cooked. Right. It's not any different than taking a piece of bread and putting it in the soup. That's what he's saying.
Isn't all coffee roasted? It's roasted.
So I have to tell you, I never had a cup of coffee in my life. So therefore, I'm a non-coffee expert, to say the least. Tea is my thing. So I don't really know so much about coffee. But I think you're correct. I think most coffee, you don't get straight off the plant. I think most of the coffee that you get, if not all of the coffee that you get, is already roasted, or baked, however they do it beforehand. And that's why he's saying, you could take the coffee, you could take those instant coffee things, and you could run the water through it, provided the water, what you can't do is you can't heat the water. So let me give you what you can't do, right? Many of you have a Keurig or what's the other one called? There's a Nestle's one. Also, there the water is cold. So if I press the button, aside from the electrical issues, right, I'm heating the water. So I can't do that, right? I can't heat the water. But if I have a pot of hot water, like a Tiger urn, or something like that, and so it's already heated or preheated or however, so now I could take from that, I could pour that water into a cup where the coffee exists already, because the coffee was already cooked, right? That's the key component here. Since the coffee is already cooked, we have a principle in halacha called en bishul achar bishul. There's no cooking after cooking. What does that mean? There's no cooking after cooking. The sin that you're not allowed to do is to cook something. So if it's cooked already, you can't cook it. It's cooked, right? So there's no cooking after cooking. It's not always, that rule doesn't always apply, but it applies here, right? Meaning if the item was cooked already, you can't cook it again, right? So even though you're changing it and it looks different and you wouldn't drink it beforehand, even still, it's going to be allowed, and therefore you're allowed to do this.
Rabbi, the instant hot water from the sink is not allowed either.
No, because the instant hot water from the sink is just like your Keurig, right? It's basically taking cold water and heating it up really, really quickly. So that is bishul. That is not allowed, right? So we're only talking about where the water was heated appropriately, right? Meaning, basically, it's coming out of an urn, right? But a lot of the machines that we have don't do that, right? They have the water, sitting there cold, and then they heat the water. That you can't do, right? So,
and if the housekeeper makes it for you without asking, you're okay?
No, we're gonna get to that. But basically, the only way you would allow to be able to have it if the housekeeper makes it is if the housekeeper made it for herself. And that's for real, right? And you have to say for real, right? Like one of the ways, right? Like let's say the housekeeper makes 15 cups of coffee, right? Then she didn't make it for herself. She made 2, right? And she was planning on drinking both. Then you could take one, but not recommended, not so simple, and honestly shouldn't be done. It's too easy to cross boundaries. We should not have non-Jews cooking for us, just like we shouldn't be cooking. So even whatever food we're going to eat, we should look at it from the food perspective, not from the who's doing it perspective. Whatever we're going to eat should play by the same rules, whether we did it or the non-Jew did it. And for the most part, that's how we're going to operate.
Same rule goes for a timer?
A timer we're going to get to. A timer might be okay, and that's one of the ways that we make coffee, right? Meaning there's no, I can't have my non-Jew do work for me on Shabbat. We learned that. I can't have my animal do my work for me on Shabbat. We learned that too. But my machine can do certain work for me on Shabbat, and because there's no rule against my machine doing work for me on Shabbat. So there are certain rules where we allow timers, right? So classic case, everyone knows we use timers, is for lights, right? You can turn the light on and off in my bedroom and my dining room and so on. I can't turn the light on and off. I shouldn't tell my non-Jewish worker to turn my light on and off. But I can have a machine self-programmed, or whatever I programmed it before Shabbat, that it does lights on at 6 o'clock, goes off at 10 p.m. or something like that, no problem. So the same thing holds true with my my hot plate, right? And in fact, this may be recommended for people. I have an electric hot plate, put it on a timer, let it go on when you need it and off when you don't. It might be safer actually, and it's a recommended thing. Same thing holds true for my hot water. And this is one of the things I believe gets done in shul, as we have a timer and it goes on and off and so on, and so therefore you could have certain things on timer beforehand. And in theory, with today's technology, you could have Google, set up all sorts of stuff for you, and it really wouldn't be such a problem. It would be pretty okay for the most part. So all that we've said today has to do with coffee, right? Coffee, because coffee is primarily cooked beforehand. We called it the Nescafe. We're going to talk about tea now. tea is very different, right? Because tea is generally not cooked beforehand. And there's a debate as to whether or not the tea leaves are roasted or not beforehand. For the most part, we're going to say that tea is not cooked beforehand, and therefore tea has different rules. So everything that we said today about coffee, tomorrow we're going to say different about tea. We need to explain that and get to that and so on. I will add one other thing about the coffee, which I don't think anyone would ever do this any other way, but I'll say it anyway, right? Is we're saying you're allowed to take the hot water straight from the pot, right, from that klidi shon, and pour it right onto the coffee grounds, to the instant coffee. That's provided there's no liquid in it. It's not milk, right? But if it was liquid, we wouldn't do that. Liquid, it's got to do something different. You can't go, you can't heat the liquid, as we've said. It has to be not. So therefore, I don't know that anyone would ever do this, but people like to add milk to their coffee. You have to add the milk to the coffee after you already put the hot water in, not before, right? You don't want to be pouring onto that liquid. So that's an added little twist. I don't think anyone would put the liquid cold onto the coffee. Doesn't make any sense to me. So, but in case anyone was thinking of doing it that way, you shouldn't do it that way. I'm going to stop here for today because tea is a whole nother bowl of yarn, which we're going to get to tomorrow, and then we'll get to some other things that go into this. Any questions that anyone has on anything that we said today?
I had one quick question. A water cooler, they have the hot and the cold water cooler. Okay, but they do leave the water in a reservoir before you push the button.
So they do, but not heated. The water that's in there, to the best of my knowledge, doesn't stay heated all the time. And even if it did, right, what also happens is as soon as I let that water out, I am basically entering more water into that very same chamber, and I'm going to cook it. So the only thing that you can really use hot water is something that is cooked from before and is not going to have any new water entering in. That's why I would use a kettle, a tiger pot, or something like that. But an urn. But anything that's the Keurig, no way. The Nescafe, no way. The thing in my sink that gives me instant hot water, no. Hot water out of my sink, to use boiling hot water or not even boiling, even really hot water is a problem. And even, as we said before, the sink in general, turning on hot water in the sink can present a problem, depends on how your house operates. Really the only kinds of hot water that we could use is hot water that's, what you might call the pre-existing hot water, or something that worked off of a timer. Off of a timer, it can be okay under the conditions that we talked about already.
Joe, I came late. Rabbi, I came late. If you have percolated coffee and it's plugged in with a timer on Shabbat, you can do it.
Right, so that's allowed because it's on a timer. On a timer, it's not a problem because you're allowed. Your machines are allowed to do work for you for the most part. We'll come up with some examples where that's not the case or we shouldn't do it. But basically, as we said about lights and Shabbat things that are needed like food and so on, those are things where we're generally going to allow it. It's generally going to be okay. Okay. Any other questions?
Rabbi, can your machine grind for you?
No. So grinding is a good question. Grinding is not permitted on Shabbat, just in general.
If it's on a timer.
If it's on a timer.
I have a coffee machine that grinds the beans on a timer.
Right.
And then makes the coffee.
Well, if it grinds the beans, then I'm wondering, is that pre-cooked? The beans are then probably not cooked.
No, they are. It's the same.
They are.
Beans are always roasted, and then they grind them.
Yeah. Okay. So then I didn't know that. Like I said, I don't know that much about coffee. I want to double check. There's something sticking in my head that's giving me some doubt. So I want to say, let me come back to that tomorrow. Let me come back to that tomorrow as to whether or not you're allowed to grind it on Shabbat by timer. Let me think about that.
Okay.
Okay.
Have a great day, everybody.
Have a great day. We're going to get started with the tefillah right now.